Nintendo! You know, that odd Japanese company that everybody in the world loves, even though some won't admit it because they think they are tough gamers or something? Well, while they do make some amazing titles, some people do think the stuff they created is just too easy. It's all just a kid's game to them. And to an extent, these people are right. Some stuff like the Kirby games are way too easy. However, there are also franchises with a lot higher difficulty, for example The Legend of Zelda. Some things in these games are just brutal, and today we will take a look at one specific department when it comes to this: the boss fights. So let's find out which bosses in the games are the hardest to beat. Number 5. Back in the day, everything in the world of video games was 2D, mostly top-down when it comes to the Zelda series, since it allows you to explore the world more effectively. And of course, Nintendo came up with some interesting bosses that used all the space created by this specific way of looking at the game. For example, the knights who use a long chain with a spike ball on it that they swing around and can hit you from quite far away. However, they also did something else, this time with a boss, which is even harder to deal with and way more annoying as well in my opinion. I'm talking about Muldaur, who's seen in the Link to the Past at the very top of the Tower of Hera dungeon. And I gotta say, this one is quite infamous, due to the fact that you may have to face it many times before you're able to defeat it. This is mostly because of the unique battlefield, because it's very different from all the others, because it has no boundaries. Which basically means that this awful creature can send you to lower floors if you're unlucky enough to be pushed off the edge. That's his entire shtick, a plan forged by the evil minds of Nintendo to torment players for days after fighting this boss. What he will do is actively charge you, and surprising enough, he has a springy and bouncy body similar to a hard hat beetle or a bumper. And this also happens when you strike it with your sword, so it will happen no matter what. If you end up falling down to the floor below, the entire battle will restart because the boss will recover all of his health. So this already makes the fight hard and a pain to deal with. Mess up once and you're back at the start. And damaging it is also not that easy. Only its tail is vulnerable, which is hard to hit thanks to its erratic movements, getting faster later on in the battle. All of this combined makes this boss hell to take on, and also very punishing thanks to the reset when you do mess up. Personally, I've had trouble with it, and it even pissed me off to an extent. As you can imagine, this stuff is very frustrating. So it 100% deserves to be on the list. Number 4. Nintendo is known for changing history. I'm not even kidding. They inspired so many famous games and ended up creating PlayStation as well. And back in the day when 3D video games were just coming up, they created a masterpiece known as Ocarina of Time. And here we saw a mini-boss that was both impressive as well as frustrating if you didn't use any cheap tricks or exploits. The famous boss known as Dark Link, who appears as a sub-boss in the water temple and materializes from Link's reflection in the water. In battle, he reacts to most of your movements and attacks, usually defending himself in the process. And he has the same amount of health as you, being a classic doppelganger in many ways except the look. When you hit it, he will fall through the floor and spring back up afterwards, and as the battle goes on, he will become more aggressive and starts actively attacking as well. Now, if you have never fought this boss, then you will most likely be in for a surprise, because he is incredibly powerful and skilled in blocking as well as dodging attacks. You basically have to beat it using legit good sword fighting tactics like slashing on the opposite side of his shield, giving you an instant hit, or using a lot of extremely powerful items, for example by stocking up on magic potions and then using Din's Fire a ton. So if you try to do this the legit way without using cheap tricks like smashing the Megaton hammer over and over, you will certainly struggle. This is what makes him so hard. He is incredibly good at sword fighting and can do the same devastating attacks as you. In general, I find it impressive how Nintendo pulled this off in 1998, and even now it's hard to beat without using any of the standard exploits. And I bet almost everyone wasn't able to do this, just like me. Number 3. When it comes to 2D Legend of Zelda games, there are a couple that I love a lot and could play again and again and again. One of those is the Minish Cap, which is a bit of a weird title for the Game Boy Advance with a brand new villain that wasn't actually Ganondorf for once. And in this quite different game, the final boss fight against the big bad guy Vaati can be a challenge as well as complicated to an extent, even having multiple forms with their own difficulties. He first transforms into a tall sorcerer called Vaati Reborn, who has a couple of different tricks up its sleeve, mostly shooting laser beams from the small eyes which orbit around him, casting fire at you, and also teleporting around the room to evade any attacks. Destroying these eyes opens his weak spot, and later on he will make it harder to damage those using some sort of black energy. After this he turns into Vaati Transfigured. This form mostly floats around, occasionally causing rocks to fall down, conjures purple spikes around the place, and electrifies himself before shooting energy balls at you. And again, the name of the game is hitting little orb things, and then striking all vulnerable eyes at the same time together with your 4-sword clones. As time goes on, he will become more and more difficult, making your life harder, and when it's down, it will transform one last time, becoming Vaati's Wrath, who still floats around, shooting energy projectiles, and making his arms emerge from the ground. And what you need to do is get inside one of the arms. And once you're in, you need to destroy the eye that functions as the arm's core. You need to do this twice to get rid of both arms, and after this he becomes more serious. From that point onward, he will charge up blue energy balls, which you can reflect back at his eyes. But should less than 4 of his eyes be destroyed, he will not be stunned and the eyes will reappear immediately. Now, as you can see, this fight is complicated and has a lot of different mechanics put into it. So it's a lot to take in, to be honest. It's well made though, don't get me wrong, but some things are incredibly difficult. I especially hate to do the second phase because lining up all the Link clones is really hard. All the stuff around the arena will be in your way, and if you miss your opportunity, you can start over with it. And then you still need to survive all the other stuff thrown at you without dying, which can be quite hard since you're bombarded with lasers, rocks, energy balls, and other stuff. In some way, it's a lot like those crazy Japanese arcade space shooters, where your screen is also filled with things to avoid or dodge. So in short, all the things that fill your screen, the many forms, and boatloads of different mechanics make this a tough final boss. Number 2. Almost every game made by Nintendo is famous in some way. They have been around for ages after all and have created some classics. However, there was a time where they weren't the kings yet and experimented a lot with their main franchise of Super Mario and Zelda. And these weird little tests didn't turn out too great. Actually terrible in a way, since they didn't sell that well and people didn't like the games as much. For Super Mario, this was the second game in the series, but that one still has a lot of good things going for itself, which sadly enough can't be said about the second Zelda game, because it's very different from the first and has way more flaws in general. However, it's also incredibly difficult, so of course there are multiple really challenging bosses in this title, with Jerma Fencer taking the crown. He attacks you by throwing fireballs from his head, and when you land a blow to the head, the helmet will come off and be replaced by another one. This attached helmet will then begin to float around and attempts to kill you by shooting more fireballs and running into you as well. After doing this a couple of times, his true head will pop up, which you can then start attacking. However, don't forget about those helmets, because for the rest of the battle, these things will harass you with those fireballs, all while the boss is still fighting you. This barrage of projectiles and attacks, as well as the quite crude controls of this old game, make this absolute hell to go through. Even if you look at footage of the fight, you can already see this is hard to deal with and pull off without dying, making this a ridiculously hard fight, which is actually quite fitting for such an old game, since back in those days everything was stupid hard. To be honest, games have gotten a lot easier over time. In the 90s and 80s, almost everything was harder, with this boss actually being a great example of this. Sure, it's not Dark Souls yet, but my lord, it's getting close to it in my opinion. Number 1. Now we get to the hardest of the hardest boss battles seen in the entire Zelda series, and surprising enough, it was seen in the most recent title, even taking the crown of being my favorite boss seen in the entire Zelda franchise. I'm of course talking about Monk Mask Kozia, a crazy Sheikah monk that has so many wacky and cool attacks, I could talk about him for hours upon hours. Think of things like teleporting, striking you with a sword, shooting a bow using elemental arrows like fire and ice, increasing his own size, and even multiplying himself. Now, I won't go in depth on all of his skills, since I did a video on him before, so I will just put that in the upper right corner for you so you can check it out. Yet again, it's a lot to deal with and take in, which makes it especially hard for people who don't do a lot of combat in a game. And even extremely skilled players will meet their match with this one, which was also its purpose. It was the final challenge, and it pulls this off brilliantly, combining a lot of different mechanics which forces you to use all your skills, but it also overloads you with a lot of different attacks and dangers. This boss takes everything from Breath of the Wild that's cool and a big challenge, and wraps it all in one fight, literally testing all your skills, making it a crazy difficult masterpiece.